Now on to a series of introspective questions.
Oh. Thought we were done here. I'm giving the sermon and they haven't even passed out
We're almost
the wafer
done.
yet.
So who do you believe has had the greatest impact on you and the person and scholar you have become today?
Well, I've written extensively about being in a place like Cambridge, which is not just Harvard, but MIT, where I went assiduously to all of Noam Chomsky's lectures. He's probably the one scholar alive today who'll be read in 100 years. He's that important. And when I had to write an autobiographical essay for a book called Gardner Under Fire, where people shot at me, I called it a blessing of influences. So there are literally dozens of people, some of whom I know, some of whom I don't know, who've had influence on me. In my office, I don't have diplomas or awards. I have letters from people who wrote letters to me when I was a student. And the most amazing thing, which I didn't recognize until I moved into my office just a few years ago, is I have 2 letters from incredible scholars, Jean Piaget, who had enormous influence in my thinking, probably more influence in my thinking than anybody else, and Claude Lévi-Strauss, a great anthropologist. And my first popular book was about Piaget and Lévi-Strauss. Those letters were sent in English from Paris and in French from Geneva on the same day, April 10th, 1970. So I was 26 years old. And that's not a lesson to me, it's a lesson to my students. We build on other people. I think Piaget probably had the greatest influence on me. I knew him a little bit, but no, certainly not personally. I think personally probably Jerome Bruner and Nelson Goodman. Bruner, both because of his ideas and because of the social world he had around him, and Goodman because he made me very skeptical. Not cynical, he was a little bit too cynical, but very skeptical about things. And I don't believe claims just because they're made, even if they're made with Florida. I always want to know what the evidence is. And part of my writing about disciplines and writing about truth, beauty, and goodness reframed is that we can't evaluate what people say or write or show us unless we know the methods that they used. So if you tell me that you just have some interesting finding, I want to know how did you go about getting that finding and can you show me? So I think I learned that, I mean, Nelson Goodman said something to me which was frightening. He said, when I read something of yours, Howard, the first time I come with something I don't understand, I stop reading. And I've never been that way with students, but it's a pretty powerful superego. So I think that probably those are the 2 people whom I knew well, both of whom I mentioned were at my ad hoc, as they call the tenure evaluation thing, who probably had the most influence on me. And I regret that there were no men who had the same influence on me, but a woman who had enormous influence on me was Suzanne Langer, who was a great philosopher, would have taught at Harvard, except that her husband was teaching here, and there was a nepotistic rule, but she was actually the teacher of my first wife, Judy Krieger Gardner, and I learned about Suzanne Langer significantly through Judy, and that was a great intellectual influence. We use the word paragon for that. Paragon is somebody who you don't know personally, but you have a huge influence on you. And if you ask me, I don't know this is on the list or not, who is the human being who, in memory of the greatest influence, and also who you're going to ask me who I wanted to have dinner with, it would have been Gandhi.
Gandhi, okay.
Because I think Gandhi is the most important human being of the last 1,000 years. I think Christ was the most important person of the last 2,000 years. I suppose that it'd be interesting to talk to both of them, but so much of what we know about Christ is legend that it's much harder to think about what that would be. Whereas with Gandhi, we have a lot of people know him still around, so it's a very different kind of thing.
Sure. What inspires you?
Well, we've talked about, paragons who've inspired me. Just this past week, I had lunch with a younger person who I'd met once before and some of whose work I knew. And it was a transformative lunch for me. It was a 40-year-old, and he said and told me about so many things that I guess I was ready to hear, would never have thought of myself. And I began to write to people and put him in touch with people, so that was inspiring. I guess, I've already said works of art are the things that have the most impact on me. And so, when there are contemporary artists like James Turrell, who I think has lived in Arizona or New Mexico, I'm not sure which, or artists from my lifetime like Mark Rothko. I would happily go to Texas to look at his cathedral, his church installations, or great literary works, great works of music. I would walk many miles to hear a good performance of a Mahler symphony. It's inspiring, but there's nothing like holding your own grandchildren. I mean, that's the peak.
Yeah. What do you find uninspiring?
Banality. I love movies, and I love good stuff in television, but it's hard enough to discover what's really worthwhile that I have to hear a lot of talk about something to want to spend time on it. We did a big study, which is being published now, about what do people admire the most in the 21st century, and we were asking them about quality, and we thought they would talk about wristwatches. Nobody has a watch anymore, or about cars, but kids don't drive anymore. There's actually some data on that. Or about their computers or their smartphones or their pads. And the surprise was how many people, both in the United States and abroad, said time well spent. And the same people who spent hours each day, looking at Facebook and fixing their portrait, lament the fact that they spend so much time and it's not time well spent. So banality and wasted time are things that don't inspire me. But wasted time doesn't mean how much time. So if I'm going to a meeting, I don't ask how many hours it is. I ask, is the time going to be well spent?
Sure.
And I would rather spend 3 hours, or like with Norman Geschwind, 8 hours at a meeting where it's well spent, than 5 minutes. And I will see every student who wants to see me from Harvard, and any student from elsewhere if they have a legitimate thing. But I ask beforehand, what are we going to talk about, and send me a note. Because if all they want is a photograph, we don't have to sit there and say hem and haw.
Sure.
But there's an interesting thing there from an educational point of view, which is that a number of times in my life, there's been a student in the class who said absolutely nothing. And so, of course, I don't know the student, and they write something that's wonderful. And one of the great things about, and then I say I'd like to speak with you. One of the great things about the new media is there are more ways for people to show that they can connect. It isn't just waving your hand.
Sure.
So yeah, it's again, it's the short time we have here, the fragility and frailty. We shouldn't intentionally waste time. At the same time, with Dick Light, we've begun reflection sessions at Harvard, where we just let students reflect on their lives. We've done it in other places. It's being imitated. It's moving up from freshmen to... I think that some people are so connected and are so busy monitoring their machines all the time that they don't have any time to reflect, and that's actually very bad. And when people ask me, if you're just suddenly given some free time, what do you do? They're very surprised to hear that often I would just lie in bed and think and let my mind. So that's reflection. Is it time well spent? I don't know, but I think if I didn't do that, it would be bad.
Sure. What is your favorite word?
I actually was once asked that for a book, and I came up with an answer. It's a little bit banal, since we're talking about banality, but it was a subject of an interesting little essay. It was yet. Because when I write in particular, I like to lay out the opposite point of view, but then I want to say and yet's a very short word which allows me to put forth the other point of view. So when we were talking a minute ago, and I said, I hate wasting time, the and yet would have been, you do need to make time to reflect.
Yes.
And one of the reasons many people like to travel is because at least when you're in an airplane or in a hotel room, there are fewer people that can bother you, and you have more time to reflect. So yet's a word that I like. I've gotten a lot of trouble for saying that my least favorite word is webinar, and my second least favorite word is Skype. But probably in 10 years I'll just accept those because they're a part of life.
What is your favorite curse word?
Well, I wish I didn't curse, but I do. And recently I cursed in front of somebody with a young child in the car, and I apologized. But I guess the answer is the same as other people. I don't have, there's not depends on the environment. I mean, there's certain words which I would not say in front of a child intentionally, but if I said "damn it," I probably would.
Okay. What profession other than your
Has
own?
anybody given you a good answer to that?
Oh, we've had a plethora of answers, and a lot of people have declined. So they're running the gamut. What profession other than your own would you have liked to attempt?
I think about that a lot. As you get older, then it's the kind of question you ask. I guess the first thing is I have no regret about going into scholarship. It's the life that scholarship and teaching that for me has been golden. I went into psychology, but I could easily have gone into another social science. I think in many ways I'm more of a historian than I am a psychologist, but I also love biology. I love doing neurology. I used to joke I was a neurologist from the neck up. I don't think I could have done the highly mathematical or the highly delicate things in biology, but I think biologically as well as historically, and theory of multiple intelligences does not pose problems for biologists because it's very biological. It has to do with how the brain has evolved over thousands of years. It's not very psychological because we don't have a test for it. So I think the academy was the best thing. If I hadn't gone into the academy, I would have become a lawyer. Well, let me give a different answer. I would have become a lawyer, but I would have hated being a lawyer unless I got to be a judge, and you can't do that. And if I'd gone to medical school, I would have hated it, but I wouldn't have minded being a psychiatrist or neurologist because I would have been dealing with issues of the mind. Recently, and this is really just in the last few years, I've thought a lot about journalism, both because journalism was the first domain that we looked at in the Good Work Project, and because journalism is under such enormous strain now, but also because while I don't like to blog, I blog, and because so much of journalism now is doing things very quickly, and I can write very quickly, but I don't really like it because I like to be able to think about things. I like to be able to reflect, and of course, it used to be in journalism, at least, you could write for the next day's newspaper. But now, by the next day, the story is already old hat.
Yeah, right.
The Pope is already, everybody knows about it. So you have to blog and just keep up every moment. But I think maybe the answer is the same as the answer for law and medicine. If I could be a columnist for the New York Times, that would be fine.
Sure.
But the chances of being a columnist for the New York Times is about as low as the chances of being a judge, and it's not something that you can make happen.
Sure.
And so, and I think maybe this is a good message for people. The life of a teacher and a scholar can be satisfying even if you're not a judge or a columnist. But I would not have wanted to help people who are guilty avoid going to jail, people who are already rich getting very richer. And I actually worked in an emergency room when I was thinking about being a medical student, and I don't actually, I'm not excited by people's injuries, though of course I'd like to be able to help them.
Sure. What profession other than your own would you have not liked to attempt?
Well, it's funny, I never was attracted to business. My father and everybody before me was a business person, and I think it was helpful to me, but I've never been attracted to be a business person. I had a thought last week, which I hadn't thought about before. Nowadays, everybody talks about being a serial entrepreneur, which means starting one business after another. I would never have had any desire to do that, but in a sense, I've been a serial idea entrepreneur, because we have people in my field, and they're often very good people, who study the same thing for 40 years, and I would go totally nuts doing that. And one of the reasons that I bonded so much with Jerry Bruner is he also gets bored very easily, so he gets moved to new things. So in a certain way, I've been a serial idea entrepreneur, and anything that I wanted to do, I had to raise money for. It wasn't raising money by selling something tangible, but I was sort of selling my ideas. So in a funny kind of way, I did repeat what my forefathers and foremothers did, namely, I was in business, but I was in the business of ideas. Yeah. Just like I said with reference to my mother, she's a connector, but she connects people in the human dimension. I connect people more by ideas.
What is your favorite book?
Well, I knew you were going to ask that question, and it's not something that I think about in that way. But when I was teaching undergraduates, I had them read Claude Lévi-Strauss's autobiographical book, Triste Tropique, which was a story about how a French intellectual went to Brazil in the 1930s in searching for the noble savage, the Rousseauian savage, and discovered at the end of the day we're all human beings. And then he became a great anthropologist, and my first popular book was about Piaget and Lévi-Strauss. I got to know Lévi-Strauss much better than Piaget. He only died a year or two ago. So that's a book, but in a sense, it's a book which was important for me, but also one that I said to students, this is the kind of thing you wouldn't ordinarily look at. So I don't know if it's my favorite book. I used to read all the novels of John le Carré. I loved Dickens. George Eliot is a great fiction writer. But now most of my reading is sort of to help me with my work, and I don't have as much time for leisurely reading. I thought Philip Roth had a wonderful new run after some books that weren't very good. And I loved reading John Updike, but it was not his novels after his first novels. It was his criticism. I thought he was... When he died, I said, who's going to tell me what's going on now that John Updike is dead? So I have a lot of, I would say, more favorite writers rather than favorite books.
If you could tell President Obama one thing, what would it be?
Well, I used to have an elevator speech for President Obama, and it was about good work and to help people be excellent, engaged, and ethical. But we're now in 2013, and I guess what I would say to him is that I think his values are very admirable, that he gave a State of the Union address and he gave an inaugural address in 2013. His State of Union address was a bunch of what I would call small bore programs, which is probably all that he can expect to accomplish in the next years, because he'll be a lame duck after 2014, and because he has a Congress which simply does not want to play ball with anybody. But in his inaugural address, I saw him laying the groundwork for the next 40 years. And Arthur Schlesinger, the great historian whom he clearly knows, said in America we have 30-year cycles. And the cycles are not predictable, but it is predictable that we're in a 30-year cycle. And the 30-year cycle in America really began in the late 20th century, and it's over. What his job now is to help define the next cycle, which is one for a country which will be incredibly demographically diverse, a country where the division between rich and poor is obscene, a country which can no longer tell the rest of the world what to do, but has to contribute to peace and to climate control. And he has to set into motion groups of young people, institutions, even political action committees, though I nauseated at the whole idea, which can help bring about that 40-year change. And I'm not telling him anything he knows, but I may be stating it to him in a more clear way, and to say that he should keep his eyes at least as much on that as on whether the particular thing about gun control passes, or whether or not the budget or the sequestration. Because really what he has to do is get people in Washington who are willing to work for the country rather than just for their own political interest. And once they do that, they can get rid of Citizens United, which is the single worst decision the Supreme Court has made since the Dred Scott case. And we haven't gone political toward now, but since you asked, that's what I would tell Mr. Obama.
If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
This is a question which has an awful lot of counterfactual counterfactual clauses into it. This is a question which has a very high counterfactual component to it. I guess I would not want to be greeted different than anybody else, but if there are things one could do there to improve things, I try to find other right-minded people.
Okay. When asked to capture the essence and nature of Howard Gardner, your friend and colleague David Perkins describes you as hardworking and intellectually strikingly productive. You have a keen nose for areas of inquiry, ripe for pursuit, both in terms of what the big questions are and what might be timely in terms of big questions. Your son Andrew describes you as an insanely hard worker who continued pushing yourself and expanding your realm of expertise. Though you will always be known as the multiple intelligences guy, he's glad that you've moved on in your research. He added that you have little interest in licensing and that you haven't sold out. Of that, he's proud. Your son Jay appreciates your dedication to your family, writing that your dedication to your family rivals your dedication to your work. You are a loving, communicative, and supportive father, a devoted son to your 101-year-old mother, and an absolutely wonderful grandfather to his children. He adds that he has never seen you as happy as when you're bantering with your grandson or holding your granddaughter. He is grateful that his kids have the luxury of taking their opa for granted. Your son Ben says that you have been a great father to 4 kids and all the while had a very time-consuming career, but you always had time for your family whenever they needed you, no matter what continent you have been on. You are passionate and you care deeply about everything you do, including the best part, being a dad. Your friend and colleague Marcelo Suarez Orozco describes you as half Mick Jagger and half Charles V. Like Mick, you are a rock star. Like Charles V, the sun never sets on your empire of ideas. Regarding your most important achievement, he writes that it is still too soon to tell. Your most immediate and practical achievement is that you gave teachers the world over their permission to teach children in ways that they intuitively understood were better to engage children with different learning styles. Finally, your wife, Ellen, praises your ability to think synthetically and analytically. Most people are stronger at one than the other. And you have vision and think about the big picture. Your questions always go to the heart of the matter, and you are an incredible mentor to your students, always giving them quick and detailed responses to their work. You are also a devoted father to your 4 children and grandfather to your 2 grandchildren, one of your most important accomplishments in your life. Well, there's no doubt that...
Am I supposed to cry at this?
Yes. No. Well, there's no doubt that actually, in your own words, we view you as a psychologist, scholar who has tried to understand the human mind in its full richness and complexity. You seek to share your conclusions both with other scholars concerned with the mind and with the broader educated public. On behalf of all of us, educators, scholars, future educationists, educational researchers, and the like, we thank you, Dr. Howard Gardner, for everything you do and mostly for being you, working on all of our behalves every day. It's been a pleasure to interview you.
Thank you. I'm very touched and very grateful.
Good. I'm so happy that you agreed to participate.